have a low-code platform for data application orchestration and cloud infrastructure management. So if you are interested in saving time on your Azure development, please check us out at fathom.com. It's FATHYM.com. And I want to welcome you today to this panel. We've got a really great panel of experts on GDPR and data privacy. And just in preparing for this session, we were having a really great conversation. So it's nice to welcome you into that conversation and cover some really pertinent topics in data privacy today. I'd like to start by welcoming our speakers and panelists and let them introduce themselves briefly, and then we will get back to our discussion. So first up, we have Charlotte Gerrish. She's the founding lawyer at Gerrish Legal. Maybe you want to introduce yourself, Charlotte, and tell us a little bit about your practice.
Yeah, hi Carly, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I'm the founding lawyer of Gerrish Legal, which is a digital law firm based in Paris, specializing in commercial law, but also in data privacy and GDPR. So assisting companies that are not necessarily based within the EU and aren't familiar with the regulation, as well as assisting startups across Europe, particularly with a focus on the UK, France, and the Nordics.
Welcome. Silvan Jongerius, we met here in Berlin at several blockchain events, so I know that you're an expert in that space, and you founded TechGDPR. Can you tell us about your company?
Sure, thank you, Carly. Yeah, so TechGDPR is a consultancy that is not a law firm, but a consultancy focused at helping technology companies with their GDPR compliance and privacy in general. And as such, we help companies all over the world actually to meet the requirements and to organize in such a way that they get towards a privacy-friendly and GDPR-compliant product or service. Based in Berlin, and yeah, as you said, we met at blockchain events, probably because we do quite a bit in the deep tech space in blockchain. I'm also the founder and president of an association, Bearchain, that gets the blockchain scene in Berlin together. And we also deal with technologies such as machine learning, AI, IoT, etc. So basically everywhere where it's getting technical.
Well, great. That's the perfect topic for our panel then. Christine Sorensen, welcome. Christine is the founder and director of Global Health Literacy Academy.org.
Yeah, my name is Christine Sorensen. I'm based in Denmark, and I'm the founder of the Global Health Literacy Academy. I don't know why they put the website there, but you can find me now. And I'm also the president of the International Health Literacy Association. And we are, of course, focusing a lot on digital health literacy. So with all the new digital services that are popping up, which mostly is for the advantage of citizens and patients, we also do see some barriers to it, and I'm happy to be on board in the panel today. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Sasha Gardenbach, President and CEO of Via AG. Welcome. Oh, Sasha, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I just realized it.
Thank
you for welcoming. So yeah, I said I'm also the founder of Via AG. I also founded a second company. It's the Global Citizen Foundation that actually belongs, both company belongs to it. So, and what we are aiming to do is basically with the foundation to educate the society about the importance and the value of data and also the power of technology, and defining a new rule work that is more practical and on top of GDPR, if you will. And with Via AG, we are building technology that is connecting people and organizations in I would say in a whole new way around personal and private data, and that's helping to basically level up in that discussion and providing possibilities to take advantage of the whole topic on the data privacy discussions. Yeah.
Great, we're happy to have your expertise here today. Thank you. Matthias Reichert, a corporate data strategy for BMW. Welcome to the call today. Please let us know a little bit about what you do in the data privacy space.
Yes. So I researched in my PhD how transparency can be measured quantitatively. And so that's my main question, because it's not enough to just propose we have transparency, but we need to actually get to the user experience side. And so that's my main motivation to be here, also discussing how this can be done on a more global scale.
Great. Thank you for bringing that practical perspective to our panel today. And I think the last speaker to introduce would be Chad Wollen, founder of Privacy Experience Agency. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so I got drawn into all of this because I was so fascinated with the way that the GDPR puts people at the center of its legal framework. As someone who's been working in marketing for 25 years, I've always thought that the customer needs to be central to everything that we're doing. I've been very, very disappointed in the way that the talk is never met by action. And I just felt it's great to see a law where maybe companies are obliged to start listening to their customers, and we can start building the experiences and the services around privacy that the customers deserve.
Well, you know, that is a perfect lead-in to our first question today, which is, let's talk about trust. As I was preparing for our panel today, I noticed that quite a few of you, almost all of you actually, have the word trust prominently displayed on your website, or you mention it in your bio, so it seems really important. Chad, maybe you can start us off talking about how trust and data privacy relate.
Okay, well, I mean, firstly, trust is one of the major goals of the GDPR and the single digital market. So we can't escape talking about trust in the law, but actually I think there's a couple of steps back about when we think about trust. I prefer to think about trustworthiness and how we help people see institutions as being trustworthy. And I think that starts by understanding that where trust comes from, and trust comes from people understanding the motivations behind businesses wanting their information. What is in it for them, and why are they doing this? And am I going to be treated fairly? And that's about what we consider really important, which is this idea of respect and respectful engagement with data subjects around their data. And then also, more tangibly, do they actually have the capability to deliver on those motivations? And that doesn't just mean do they do the great AI work, but actually the capability to deliver on the exercise and fulfillment of their rights under the GDPR. So it's a full package. It's not just the end product, but it's also the whole end-to-end about understanding how you put together a full privacy experience. And trust is an outcome of those things. And one needs to break it down a bit first. So understanding motivations and building capabilities and communicating those things clearly. And trustworthiness.
Trustworthiness. So building on this concept, what does ethical data research look like? That seems like a really important element of trust. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I think, let me start, and also coming back to what Chad just said, if you look at the topic and if you look where the trust is when it comes to data, I think we had a couple of events where we can say that trust itself was debated. So we have seen like bad actors, which made it quite popular to the media. Obviously with the most leading one, Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, don't need to say that here. But we have also seen a lot of data breaches where people got affected. And then obviously lately there was a big data privacy debate when the first technologies came onto the table to solve the issue of Corona and to understand the virus better. I think there was a good debate, or triggered a good debate about data privacy. And if you look like what data privacy really means in the information age, and I think that is important, and that's also a bit distincting from of GDPR. I think data privacy in the information age is really about choice. It's about freedom, that you give to the user who owns the data mainly. So the one having the choice, like who to share the data with, or with whom, and to what level of detail you're sharing the data with, and also understanding how data might be used and getting all the transparency in that one. And if you think of an ethical data research, the main challenge from the researcher is that they need data, you know, like when you look at the data research, and they have to have it. And I would say quite easily it is when the personal data is researched with explicit consent by the user, or shared with explicit content by the user. So that means giving control over your data, providing the full transparency over your data, make it clear and simple, as Chester said. I like that statement a lot. And having the user being in that position where he can decide if he feels comfortable, like the data is going to be used, and putting them in the driver's seat. Yeah, that's my first thought here.
Challenge, of course, is one challenge here, of course, is that you don't know always in advance which kind of combination of data you would need. And especially if you are in a data science sphere, where the combination of different sources of data is what you actually want to get new insights, to get new products and solutions. That's something where you don't know in advance what the purpose will be. And so this difference between knowing what the goal is in the end and knowing what you want to research in the beginning is quite a challenging one to communicate to the end users.
Yeah, I think that comes down to, like, one of the key principles of the GDPR is accountability. So it's ensuring that the companies that are responsible for processing personal data of individuals are actually accountable and are able to stand behind their decisions. So it's really interesting what you said about clearly defining the purpose initially. So there's obviously the concept of data minimization under the GDPR, where you really only need to collect what is necessary for achieving the goal. You know, likewise, we were talking earlier about the different apps for tracking and tracing for the current pandemic. You know, what is the actual data that's required from users of those apps in order to achieve the goal? And I think it goes to say that GDPR compliance is not something that's fixed and occurs on one specific date. It's actually an ongoing collaboration, and that's something that I see quite often with my clients too. And I think that once, you know, startups or even larger companies that are dealing with personal data or are working in the new technologies field kind of get behind that and have kind of privacy culture as a really big key element through the entire organization, then we can start to talk about trustworthiness. Because I think responsibility, accountability, and trustworthiness kind of all go hand in hand. And I think one of the biggest difficulties that we have at the moment is that the law does not always keep up with new technologies. You know, new technologies are developing so fast. And I think we might talk about this later with blockchain. You know, there's a very much concept of the black box effect, where a user can input their data, they have no idea how it's being processed. Quite often I see like negotiations and discussions about the tech company wanting to retain that data for machine learning and AI development, but then there's a big issue there because it's containing personal data. So again, it comes down to what we need and what the purpose is. You know, can we use other techniques in the GDPR, like anonymization of data, for example, so you can't actually identify any individual user, aggregate it, pseudonymize it ultimately. So there's lots of different techniques, I think, within the GDPR, which are kind of general application. I think one of the difficulties is when we are coming to look at new technologies or something specific, like a pandemic right now, or questions of, I don't know, discrimination or difficulties for minorities, is kind of how we can work together to apply the GDPR in a practical sense, as practitioners, as developers, as founders, and also as supervisory authorities in charge of kind of dealing with these issues. You know, should we be looking at implementing certification schemes? That's allowed under the GDPR. There are basically none, to my knowledge, right now. Similarly, like codes of conduct, which can kind of provide overall general guidance, which can make companies that are processing data in innovative ways more accountable and therefore seeming more trustworthy to the end users.
Let's build on this idea of how technology can actually assist with data privacy and coordinate with the GDPR. Silvan, can we go to you to talk about what you see in the deep tech space as far as the intersection with data privacy?
Sure, and I think what you mentioned is actually very interesting, right? So many people, especially if we look at blockchain, see a lot of problems. Blockchain is immutable, yet under the GDPR, there's the concept of the right to be forgotten, where basically the data subject has the right to request a deletion of data in certain circumstances. and for example, the public element of many blockchains, right? So that we share the information all around all the participants is just doesn't make it a great place to store personal information. However, there are certain things that blockchain is not one technology. It's a broad range of technologies that can be used, and it can also be used in a way to aid GDPR compliance. For example, certain elements of the GDPR require registries to be kept, and that is something where a blockchain can offer a immutable registry or a history of events that can also aid with data privacy. Just as one example in the blockchain space, perhaps.
Thank you for giving us some insight on that. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, it's very, very easy to talk about technology, because that's kind of what interests us all, and the law, because after all, the GDPR is a law. But where are people in all of this? And the GDPR provides a lot of different points where we need to be asking, before we think about the technology and before we think about the law, what are people thinking about this? And Charlotte's point about accountability is a really critical one, because it's often really important just to ask ourselves, accountable to whom, right? And quite often we say our boards or our management or the regulator, but we miss out the data subject. And once we start focusing in on the fact that the accountability structures that we need to put in place are to let people hold us to account, then it might be that some of the ways we approach ethics and the law and fairness and transparency become slightly more focused, and slightly kind of, because we have a definite audience and thought in mind, which is, this is all about the data subject. It's about their rights, their empowerment, and their protection. And we need to be thinking about that. And to be honest, technology, starting with technology, in my experience, is often a way to write users out of the equation. We know from experience that users and technology is often it's a struggle. So and the law and users, it's a struggle. So we need to oversteer to put users in the driving seat.
I think in that regard, it's just for me, GDPR is a box to tick. You know, on the website, there is a question, you tick the box and you can move on to the website you wanted to see, or the service you wanted to see. And I think most people on the street would not know what's behind those 4 letters. We haven't done enough, or either it's presented as a barrier because there are all these, it's a legal term, and people just don't know what it covers. Only us, the experts. So there's a huge job to ensure that people know what it is, understand it fully, and can evaluate whether they say yes or no to share their data, and to understand what it's being used for. So I don't know whose responsibility it is, perhaps both the citizens and, let's say, the services, the systems, the regulators, as was mentioned before. But at this point in time, I fully agree that we haven't done the job of having it user-centered.
Not wanting to be too much of a Zoom hog, but I always start by kind of grounding that thought about users and education and their engagement with privacy by starting by thinking, well, hold on a second. If we were talking about health and say diabetes, which is out of control, and the amount of effort that goes into trying to get people to think about how they engage with the life and death decisions that they're making about their diet and their exercise, we know that's really hard work. When we think about financial services and trying to get people to save for their futures or not be indebted, we know that's really hard work. Getting people to engage with these really difficult topics is hard. So focusing on motivating them might not be the right way. The other side of the coin is to make it really easy to engage. And I don't think we spend enough time thinking about how we just make this easier for people, because it's going to be really hard if we take health and finance as a benchmark to get them to care or be motivated or to behave in a way that we all desire. actually it's all about ease, and it's about focusing in on that. That's what I would say.
Building on that, perhaps what I see as well is that users or data subjects are very often given a choice between convenience and privacy, right? And what I see around me is that many of the people that I interact with and in general around me is that the choice is more often for convenience. I download this app to have a more convenient experience, but therefore give up a little bit of our privacy. So our privacy has basically been bought off by this convenience that we can get through apps and services.
But consent must be as
Free
easy
apps at that. Yeah. Matthias, I see you nodding your head, so I just wanted to check in and see if there's something you wanted to add to the conversation before we move to COVID. We've got to talk about that today.
So definitely, it's extremely important to differentiate between the notion of openness and the notion of transparency. So what we see people using as transparency in public debates is more openness. It's just publishing information or being open source is a very important step, but it's not making sure that the user actually is able to understand it. And this whole discussion about being able to access the information and understand the information is what really differentiates transparency from this more general broad term of openness. So if we look at the research, we know we have a very strict definition of what transparency really is. We have measuring models to do that. We know that we can assess whether users perceive that really as transparent. Can they understand what they really are being told, what's been happening? And we also have studies that show us that it can be increased by interfaces around 20–30%, depending on the case. So for data protection menus, for everything, every contact point to the end customer, you should really care about getting this contact, this user experience in a quantitative way and incorporate that evaluation into a formal process into your interfaces so that it gets a critical, important part of your development process. And the second step from transparency is the trust. It's highly correlated. We have studies for that too. We know the trust and transparency are correlated. And we also know that the acceptance and the buying behavior is influenced by that. So if we want to have this level of influence, if we want to have people accepting what is being in the software, we need to systematically evaluate it and in the process of designing, bring these insights into the process. And speaking from practice, that is quite hard to do because especially traditional companies are more on the engineering side and more on the mechanical, physical world, and telling them to take a concept like trust or a concept like transparency on a quantitative level inside of your consideration chain is quite a challenge. But it's quite possible to go there. And also for the efforts in COVID, I didn't see it happening right now. I didn't see user studies asking for perceived transparency. And in the official statements, you just hear we are open source, we are transparent.
I'd like to emphasize how important that is, that difference between openness and transparency. And there's been a lot of work done in the sphere of architecture when it comes to government buildings and parliaments about the difference between turning brick walls into glass ones and actually designing and creating buildings that help citizens understand the processes that go on in those buildings. And those are two very, very different things, as Matthias has said. And quite often all we're doing is just replacing bricks with windows. And that doesn't really help data subjects at all. And again, it's why we need to kind of move on and also start to explore the diversity of opinions and attitudes and behaviors that citizens and data subjects exhibit and how we build our experiences of privacy for them that take into account those very, very diverse places they're coming from.
To me, it comes down to the language. I hear now the term data subjects. I would never, ever recommend our students to use that word because people are not subjects. They're people or participants in a study or participants in we do it for them, with them. So that's just a reminder that we have actually, from our education in public health, tried to eliminate the word subjects.
I suppose I use it in a way that maybe in health we talk about a patient.
Or patients, citizens, people, men, women, children, whoever, but not data subjects because that's a technical term and it could be anything.
Yeah.
Tables or toothbrushes.
Charlotte, I think you had a comment, and I also wanted to thank you for answering the live question. For all of the viewers, there was a live question: how might Brexit affect the future of data privacy law? And Charlotte has put in an answer for that you can check, but I think you wanted to add a comment as well.
I think it's just really important, actually, like all of the points you've raised are really, really valid. I think it's almost unfair to put the onus of understanding data privacy and data privacy rights on individuals, because most people don't care about these issues. They don't really understand that they're important. Like we were saying, it's not a question of negotiation when you're downloading an app. You may have to give free consent, but it's like you give your consent or you don't use the app. And that's one thing that's prohibited under the GDPR. You can't refuse access to a service because a user hasn't given consent. But then in a realistic world, that's really hard to manage. And I think it's really important what you're saying. It's about the language that's used. I think obviously the GDPR talks about privacy by design, and I think there's huge merit. People have always said, okay, in that case, you need to have a lawyer on board. Yeah, you need to have someone that understands the tech, and you're going to build it around that. But I think one of the huge points that's been missing, and one of the really key roles in this process, and something that, you know, I also see with some clients, is getting a UX designer on board, and someone who is actually specialized in this and understanding user flow, understanding what's accessible, what's understandable. You know, one thing to give a customer preferences portal. We were talking about marketing data earlier, about being able to opt in and opt out, and which type of newsletters you do or don't want to subscribe to. You know, sometimes you have to respond to an email to opt out. Sometimes you're given actual access to some kind of preferences portal. But if that's not done in a user-friendly way, and what this actually means, I think then we hit a huge stumbling block. It may be possible to tick box compliance with the GDPR, but it's really an ongoing thing. Like we were saying, you know, a user, especially when dealing with something related to health, they're obviously very anxious about the issues that they may be facing in any case. So I think kind of having this overall collaboration with a kind of group of experts that really understand the sector, understand the technology, understand the law, but also understand what individual users need from a design purpose, to ensure that the boxes are not just ticked, but actually being adhered to.
There's a lot of language just to build on what Charlotte's saying. I mean, there's a lot of language we use, and it comes out a lot out of the Commission actually around toolboxes and tools that people can have. And actually, I tend to think it's better to talk about services that people can utilize rather than tools, because you have to learn how to use a tool. You have to become and to understand how that's going to work. If one starts to think about this from a service perspective, then it's about the fact that I want an end result, and I go somewhere and I get it. I get to access my data, the service for the right to access, the service for the right to rectification, not a set of tools I have to learn how to use, but as services that enable and empower me to get to where I want to go. And I think that's also where we need to be starting to think. And again, in the GDPR, the words are there: facilitation. Data controllers have to facilitate data. Apologies for using data subjects, but people.
Kind of like the issues we were talking about just before the session began, you know, in respect of the kind of myriad of apps that are out there. Like we talked about interoperability from a technical perspective. And, you know, if we're going to be having international travel, in theory, different government-based apps would need to speak to each other so that we can actually track the spread of the virus, if that's the point of these apps, you know, to have any sort of meaningful effect. But I think it's really interesting what we've just been talking about also the user experience of that. For example, to take like an app that most people have is Uber. You can download your Uber app in your home country. For example, if I'm in Paris, then I come to London for the day, and then I can use exactly the same app and achieve the services. I've learned how to use the app. I understand it. I might not exactly understand how my data is being used, or if they're keeping track of my trips for any other reason. You know, I'm a privacy lawyer, but I can't manage to read every privacy policy all the time. But I think there's something about that with a user feeling really comfortable with how the app is working. And I guess we're going to maybe discuss a bit about the different apps, and obviously COVID is the topic that, even if it's difficult because we're hearing a lot about it, but it's still really important. But I think there's something in that to ensure that even if we're having different providers, the potential Apple-Google collaboration, if you're in France or Denmark or Germany or Austria, you've also got a different app again. Like, how can we work with that to ensure that data privacy is respected, but also to ensure that there is transparency in the overall process, and how it can be most effective?
So we've been slowly making our way toward talking about COVID, and we've got about 10 minutes left, so let's do that. I would appreciate Christine starting us off, since you're in the healthcare industry. How are you seeing COVID affecting thoughts around data privacy and GDPR?
Mm-hmm. I have seen it developing, as everyone else, very quickly in the last 4 months here since it hit Europe. And in the beginning, we were all keen to learn about it because we didn't know about the disease, and we're actually still building the plane while flying. And here all our new apps are there to help us. And I did hear most people would actually like to share and contribute to science. But suddenly all normal science collecting regulations were suspended due to the urgency. And that is where I think we need to really consider, also in times of emergencies, how do we protect the data and the privacy of the citizens on one hand, and on the other hand, really lean on people's help and willingness to share data. And that goes also for many diseases. Most people are really, if they know and it's transparent what the data are used for, many people are willing to share. So how do we get that balance?
We were talking earlier about apps that are being developed for COVID, and Sasha, you were telling us about something you had been working on. Maybe you'd like to share some information about that.
Yeah, more than happy to do so. So the company VIAS was a co-founder of the initiative Healthy Together, which has been launched out of Germany when the Corona crisis started, and so with the aim to group up all the startups of the digital industry in Germany, and basically building a solution that is on one hand helping people, but also like getting back trust into the economy, and obviously like stimulating the economy again. Like that was like one of the first motivations, because like the startups has been the most affected of the crisis as well in the industry. So we were developing the application, and obviously we were co-developing it with SAP and Telekom for Germany. And what I can share is like there was a lot of learning in it. So obviously what the discussion before was about trust. How do you create trust? Like starting from scratch. How do you build trust on scale? So obviously there is like different user groups starting at the age of 16 until the age of like 90 plus, obviously with the most risk groups. So, and what I've seen how to build trust, and there was no time to have a debate how the data should flow and then building the technology. I think it all came together, and it was just showing that actually is working very well together, and also the way how to build trust, the way you communicate, the way you're designing the underlying technology that people actually trusting and also using in that way. And there were good learnings of what was not quite successful. We have seen examples in Korea and Taiwan, Singapore. They have been not truly successful. Israel was very pragmatic with their approach. That was also shaping the discussion, like what is the apps and the technology being used in Europe. We have also seen the limits of GDPR. I think in the beginning of the Corona crisis, like GDPR was a kind of like deactivated, or some areas has been deactivated, if I'm using the right word. And then later in April, May, there was a new rule book being brought out by the European Union, how this technology must look like. However, what it was in a summary, I think the reactions and also the understanding where the limits of current regulation was quite dynamic and quite agile, of like adopting to the true need, and also then seeing the importance of communications, getting trust into the heads of people, having an adoption council that is helping to think in the different user groups that such a technology might face, and also proving and saying that basically the data that's been shared at some point, and that's the case if you're positive, then you have this key information that's been stored on the server, is safe, and having this full transparency. And was all come together. I think open source was one step to it, like the way you communicate was one step to it. The protocol that has been used, which is DP3T now, is the most dominant in Europe. There's still some exceptions in the UK or France that has been used, and that was like creating trust because it was coming out of academia. And then still, I think, Apple and Google did quite a fair job of explaining like that they are just making sure devices can talk and operate to each other. And I think that's overall, I think it was a good a good way where you see how these things come together. And obviously, coming back to Christine's point, where you know, you have technology, they might not be the experts in healthcare. You know, then you have healthcare, they're not the experts in communication. You have the communication, that's not the experts in both. So, but you have to bring together the teams, and you see like it's quite a complex setup if you want to reach trust at multiple levels. Yeah, I think that was like one of the biggest key takeaways from my side, learning like what is truly required of being successful, of driving adoption, which is so crucial in that space, and also creating a picture that allows people to understand what data and information are. Yeah, because very abstract.
Does anyone think that GDPR needs to be adapted to some things that we're seeing because of COVID? Has it brought to light any issues that might need to be changed?
I think, just taking this a bit from a lawyer's perspective, I think that the point of the GDPR is that the kind of COVID pandemic hasn't necessarily brought up any issues that we weren't already aware of. I think for the last 2 years, a lot of issues have been raised. For example, how can we best use new technologies? How can we handle sensitive data, which is, you know, for example, relating to ethnic origins, or in this specific context, health data. I think that there's quite a lot of onus that's actually put on the supervisory authorities when it comes to enforcement. I think there's also a lot of onus on practitioners and how the GDPR is actually being applied in practice. As I mentioned, like at the very beginning, the GDPR in itself, in my mind, is quite a generic and quite general technology, and also social circumstances are developing much faster. I think obviously making a change to the privacy law, the GDPR at an EU level, is going to be impossible and take so much time. And by the time that actually comes through to be enacted legislation and then transposed nationally, the playing field will have already changed again. So I think like it comes down to you know, supervisory authorities taking a kind of collaborative approach. They are there to enforce, but they're also there to oversee. So I think the ICO said that they would have to ensure that regulators apply their authority, taking into account the various situation in the context. And I think it comes down to being able to develop and collaborate together with various certification schemes, again, coming back to trust, and also codes of conduct, so that we can have some kind of harmonized gold standard. You know, obviously, I think the issue with the coronavirus, not just privacy issues, but generally is the speed at which this took hold. Having companies try to develop apps and take all of these, you know, situations, this new situation and the specific context into account is really hard work. I think in some ways it's amazing that we've managed to have apps that's already been downloaded by so many users, for example, in Germany and so on. And I think governments have really tried to take privacy, you know, forwards. I don't know from my perspective that changing the GDPR at this stage is really the right way to go. I think it's more about how it's being used practically, and how, you know, various industries can kind of lobby to have specific certification schemes that make sense in respect of the data that they're processing and the technologies that they're developing. I think that flexibility is probably the best way forward at this point, at least.
So from that perspective, I think we can also say that the methods and instruments that the GDPR provides for or allows are not fully used at the moment, right? And especially when it comes down to these specific circumstances, we can look at that much stronger.
I mean, again, just to build on what Charlotte was saying, if we take it frightens me to think of the process involved in after 10 years of getting from public consultation to enactment the GDPR, the idea that we're restless for it to do that again. And maybe that's where ethics comes in, because I'm normally quite skeptical about ethics, because I feel like our law in the GDPR incorporates much of what over the last 20 or 30 years are the norms of ethics around data protection. We need to focus on how they've incorporated those models and think about how we move beyond them and develop a new ethics. So maybe what we should be focusing on is not changing the law, because the law is rich and we've hardly explored what it really does. But where we do identify gaps, that's where we start thinking, well, this is about our own conformity to a set of standards and norms that sit beyond that, rather than saying we should change the law. But my instinct is the law's got what we need. It's got what we need. It's and we should be focusing on how to enact it, to bring it forward, because we've just touched the surface, really.
We are wrapping up in less than a minute, but I want to allow anyone any last comments before our session ends.
Maybe I start. I'll just say that these inspirational talks, I think, really reminds me how we need to also humanize the technologies and the legal aspects, and not forget that the human is in the center of what we work with. Thanks.
I think from my perspective, it's also important that we realize that where we used to give up our privacy for convenience, we're now doing it for safety, and we should keep realizing that as well.
I would add up on that. This trade-off between having actual impact with data and being able to enforce individual privacy is a very hard trade-off to make, but it's a discussion we have to enter as a society, and we're on a, let's say, a good compromise way in Europe with that.
I think like my closing remark is just looking at the panel today, and it's all about collaboration. It's about having people from different backgrounds with different experiences and different skill sets working together. I think there's like a question on the Q&A really briefly talking about the advice for labeling guides and certification schemes. I think obviously we don't have much time to go into that, but like the key point there is collaboration and making sure that all relevant skill sets and stakeholders, including data subjects themselves, are consulted.
Well, on that note, I would like to wrap things up since we're a couple minutes over, but I know we could continue talking about this for hours. It's been so wonderful to have so much expertise here. I want to thank Data Natives for putting together this panel, and of course, our esteemed panelists. And most importantly, I want to thank the participants of the conference and our viewers. I'm Carly Howard with Fathom, and I look forward to our next session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.